Welcome to the video on basic chemistry. And again, I just want to emphasize that these videos that you're watching, they're your choice, right? These are optional. I made them to help you, to provide a different explanation, more concise, that only focuses on the terms that I really am emphasizing in the class. And sometimes the textbook can be a bit overwhelming. And so a lot of students that I've had in the past, they prefer these videos or mini lectures, and then they might use the book more as a reference and use the book where you need a second viewing of a specific piece of the material, or for more depth later on. All right. So these by any means aren't the end all, and if you don't like them, by all means use your textbook to gather the information you need and to learn the concepts. They're just a tool. All right, so let's get started. So this first lecture is on basic chemistry. This one is much longer than I like these lectures to be. It's because there's so much basic chemistry to review, and again, I hope it is review for you. If not, then you want to put a little extra effort into this first chemistry section so that you can apply it throughout the course. Unfortunately, microorganisms are tiny, and therefore we often look at them at the molecular level, right? So much different than, say, perhaps learning structures associated with your kidney or liver. In this case, really, they are a bag of chemicals and they function. So we do a lot of chemistry or biochemistry in this class. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So this is a diagram of an atom, and an atom is the simplest or smallest unit that still gives you a pure substance or element. So gold is a common element, for example. Carbon, nitrogen, oxygen are elements. When you get to the atom, if you were to break it into its component pieces, a proton, a neutron, or protons, neutrons, and electrons, if you broke this apart, you would no longer have gold, silver, carbon, whatever it is. You would just have electrons or neutrons, for example. So an atom then is still the actual substance. Protons have a positive charge, neutrons have a neutral charge, electrons have a negative charge. The electrons are key to forming bonds, all right? They exist in orbitals or shells, and filling those shells leads to the formation of bonds between atoms, which allows us to get molecules, right, as we bond multiple atoms together. And then eventually we'll build something that will be life and will take on all these extra properties that we consider to be life. All right, so let's look at the most common atoms or elements in living things. So we have hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. All right, I like to rearrange that to say schnapps, sort of a funky spelling of it, but it allows me to remember them easily. So you should know their atomic symbols, and you should know the number of covalent bonds that each of these different atom types can form. So for example, hydrogen can form 1, carbon can form 4, nitrogen 3, oxygen 2, and so on. All right, and so we will see these throughout the molecules that form living things, all right? And so do learn the number of bonds each can form. Now, why do they form different amounts of bonds, right? Why is it that oxygen can make 2 bonds, whereas carbon can make 4 bonds? Well, what we're looking at here is an electron shell diagram. So in the middle here is our nucleus, and then these black dots are our electrons. So the inner shell, all right, which I'm going to highlight here for us, all right, it holds 2 electrons, and then the shells, as we move out from the center, hold more. And so the second shell holds 8, the third shell holds 8, and then lucky for us, we don't really need to worry about anything beyond that at this point. So they can hold up to 8 in the outer, 2 in the center. Now, the electron shells of atoms tend to be filled or empty. So for example, hydrogen only has 1 electron here, all right, and so I'm trying to make this darker so we can get a better look at it. And therefore, to get to 2, it forms 1 bond. Carbon, on the other hand, all right, if I was to delete or highlight 4 of these electrons in the outer, they have to come from somewhere else to fill that valence shell or that electron shell, and therefore carbon forms 4 bonds. All right, so it's all about filling shells and coming up with even numbers. Now, electrons tend to form pairs in these shells. And so sometimes we will see as we form different types of bonds that an electron is simply given up and transferred into the shell of another atom, right? And that'll be an ionic bond. Whereas if the electrons are actually shared in the outer shell between 2 atoms, that is a covalent bond. So sharing is covalent or co together. Now here's an example of an electron cloud, right, between 2 atoms here, and we can see these electrons, how they would form these clouds around them. And so we don't really want to think of them as these static little dots that allow us to conceptualize them as we form the bonds, but rather these dynamic moving things. And the electrons really spend more time often around one atom than another. Okay, so let's start with an ionic bond. So ions are simply charged particles or molecules, all right? So they either have a net positive or negative charge. So let's start here with sodium. In its outer shell, it has 1 electron. So its options are to find 7 electrons to fill that shell, or to lose the 1 electron. Now, the other term we need to introduce is a term called electronegativity. And so let me just spell that out for you here. All right, so electronegativity. And electronegativity is the ability of an atom to hold its electrons. So the more highly electronegative, the more tightly it holds the electrons, the more negative it's got a tendency to be. The less electronegative, the more likely it is to lose the electrons. So sodium is not very electronegative. Chlorine, very electronegative. The sodium loses its electron to the chlorine. The sodium becomes positively charged. All right. The sodium becomes positive, the chlorine becomes negative, opposites attract, and we form an ionic bond between these. So that's sodium chloride or table salt. Then if we dry it out, it forms a crystal, and that's what we're seeing here is the sodium chloride crystal. Now the next type of bond I want to discuss is a covalent bond. All right. So a covalent bond shares electrons. All right, so here we have hydrogen. Now, hydrogen is a very small atom in terms of the number of protons and electrons, right? So here we have 1 inner shell electron, whereas my carbon has 4 outer shell electrons. So the hydrogen just has 1, right? It just has that 1 shell on the very inside, and it's not full. The carbon has 4 valence electrons, and so therefore it needs to gain 4. And so what it's going to do is share an electron with this hydrogen atom, and it's going to form a covalent bond, and these electrons are shared between the carbon and the hydrogen. They spend time between each. Now, because we need 4 pairs, right, to get to 8 around our carbon in our outer shell, we can actually form 4 bonds, each with a different hydrogen atom, and that gives us methane or methane gas, natural gas. You may cook with that at home. All right. So these electrons are shared, right? They will occupy space and time around each of our atoms, and therefore it is a covalent bond, all right? Down below is simply an illustration of different ways to represent the same molecule. Now, I talked about electronegativity, right? This difference in charge between atoms entering a bond. Well, this occurs in covalent bonds also. So we form 2 different types of covalent bonds, nonpolar covalent bonds and polar covalent bonds. So the nonpolar covalent bonds exist between the same atom. So carbon-carbon bond, a hydrogen-hydrogen bond, right? Since those atoms obviously have the same electronegativity because they're the same thing, right? They therefore have no separation of charge. The other option is like we see here with carbon and hydrogen, where the atoms have very similar electronegativities, and therefore they share the electrons pretty equally, and therefore there's no real separation of charge, no meaningful separation of charge around those atoms. Now, in contrast, if we have a highly electronegative atom, such as oxygen or nitrogen, all right, and we have something that has less electronegativity, our hydrogen or our carbon over here on the right, we get a polar covalent bond. That's because the electrons will spend more time over here around these atoms and less time over here. So if we remember, our electrons are negatively charged, and therefore if they're spending more time around the atoms I've highlighted in orange, then those will have a slight negative charge. Whereas if they spend less time around these hydrogen and carbon atoms, over here in the yellow, those will have a slight positive charge. Now, the behavior of polar and nonpolar bonds will affect how molecules organize themselves, where we find them in the cell, and their final functions. And so this idea of polarity and electronegativity is extremely important. So let's look at the actual electronegativities here, and you can see that our, right, hydrogen and carbon have pretty similar electronegativities. And then if I was to make a carbon-oxygen bond, for example, the difference between those is quite substantial, and therefore the oxygen becomes slightly negative, the hydrogen will become slightly positive. All right, so let's look at water. Water is the biological solvent, right? This is what we find cells in, molecules in, right? We, in a sense, our cells in the prokaryotic world that we're going to be studying, they are aquatic organisms. And therefore, the polarity of water is vital to how our molecules will form and function. So let's look at this. And so what we have here is we've got a water molecule just with a simple diagram here in A. And we've bonded it, so we've got oxygen bonded to two different hydrogens. And we want to think of these electrons as spending more time over here, right, around my oxygen than they spend around the hydrogen. And that's what this second diagram really shows us. So the white balls are hydrogen, the red is the oxygen. And what we can see is because the oxygen is more electronegative than either of these hydrogens, it pulls these electrons towards, right, this pole over here. So there's more electron density here as we think of this cloud. Well, that means that there's sort of a negative charge over here, positive charges over here. And that's going to cause water to have all kinds of interesting behaviors. Now, the other thing we want to look at here is that the water molecule is bent, right? That these hydrogens are sort of lopsided or on one side. And sometimes this is called Mickey Mouse ears or something like that. But if this was linear, so that we had something that would be hydrogen, oxygen, hydrogen in a line, we wouldn't end up with this separation of the charge. So because of the bond angles that are formed, it leads to this phenomenon of water being polar. All right, now, because water is polar, we've got these charges, right? So here's my positive charges. I'm looking at this molecule in the top left, all right? And over here on the right, we've got this negative charge. So we've got a positive charge with the hydrogens in my water molecule over here on the left, a negative with the water. Well, we can form a weak attraction between those partial charges, right? Opposites attract. And so if you look at this diagram, we can see how three molecules of water can all stick to each other. So now imagine that water couldn't do this. Well, it would behave a lot more like rubbing alcohol or gasoline, and it would volatilize or evaporate much more fast. And therefore, you wouldn't see droplets of it so much. And the behavior of water on the planet would be very, very different, all right? And so this ability to hydrogen bond with itself, which is this weak interaction of these partial charges, gives water lots and lots of cool properties. So let's look at salt, for example, or ice, I guess is where we're going to start. So when water freezes, it forms a crystalline structure. That crystal structure actually pushes the water molecules further apart from each other than if they were down here on the right as liquid water. So what happens in liquid is, because the molecules are moving more rapidly, they bash in closer to each other temporarily, and it makes the water more dense. Whereas when they crystallize, they slow down and they actually form a perfect crystal, and it spreads the water molecules out compared to the liquid, and therefore ice floats. So if anybody out there likes the ice fish, that's why you can walk on the ice. It also means that the bottom of the ocean isn't frozen, right? Which might lead to all the water being frozen on the planet. And so ice floats. Now, another thing that water can do is it can cause the dissociation of salt. So here's our salt crystal that we talked about earlier down here. And so this is dry. We throw it in water. Well, what's going to happen is the water is going to start to enter in here, and it's going to associate based on charge. So therefore, the negative pieces, right, which is these red spheres, are my oxygen. They're slightly negative. They are going to hydrate or move around the sodium, which is positively charged. All right. And then the positive hydrogen atoms are going to move around the chloride ion. And that's going to pull or push the sodium and chloride apart, and it will basically dissociate in water, which is why you can put so much salt in water, right? As you add those crystals, they disappear quickly, and it's basically because it's being hydrated. So anything that is either polar or ionic will dissolve in water, all right? Which is an important thing to keep in mind. So polar molecules, or likes like, all right? So things with charge dissolve well in water. Now, another property of water is pH. This is the hydrogen ion concentration. Now, the pH scale is the negative log, all right, is what it is. And so it is negative log, all right, of the H plus concentration. And so I'm just kind of putting this together quickly here for us, but it is the negative log of that H plus. Well, what that means is that the scale then is inverted. All right, so let's look at what happens here to taking the negative log of something. All right, so let's go with 10 to the negative 7, for example. So this is the concentration of the H plus ion. All right, so we're talking about the ion concentration here. So when I take the negative log of this, if I was just to take the log of it, I would get negative 7. All right, which is kind of an awkward number to work with, and therefore we take the negative log and I get 7. So all the log does is it takes that exponent and converts it into a number. We take the negative so that we're working with positive values. Now, think of it this way though. 10 to the negative 14 is a smaller number than 10 to the negative 7, which is a smaller number than, say, 10 to the negative 0 or 4 or whatever, right? So what that means then is the H plus concentration increases as we move down. It decreases as we move up. All right, so a pH of 14 is very alkaline or basic. All right, so that's like straight sodium hydroxide. All right, seawater, all right, is here. So if you think about that, you may have heard of seawater acidification affecting coral reefs. Well, what's happening is seawater is moving more towards neutral, and that is detrimental to the interaction between the animal, that is the coral, right, this larger thing, and a symbiotic unicellular algae that lives in there. Urine is 6, right? Beer is pretty acidic, coffee is pretty acidic, vinegar, cola, lemon juice, stomach acid way down here. So what we want to see then is that the small numbers, if we're talking in pH, means more H plus or more acidity. The larger the number, if it's pH, means less. All right, and so you just have to kind of learn how that works. And so spend a little time looking this thing over. All right, so now water also forms the basis of how we create and destroy large molecules. So these boxes here, all right, and so I'll highlight one of them, just because I seem to like highlighting today. All right, so these represent individual molecules that are being linked together. And so if we're going to add another molecule onto this here, we remove water. And so we call it dehydration synthesis. And this is how we make proteins, nucleic acids, even lipids and all sorts of, so fats and oils. All these molecules, as they're built, are built by dehydration synthesis. The cool thing then is to break them apart, all we have to do is add the water back on and we can remove those individual molecules. So makes you wonder then if our proteins are surrounded by water, why don't they just fall apart? Well, this bond right here is pretty stable, and this takes a catalyst. It's going to take an enzyme really to make this fall apart. Okay. So anyway, so water is key to that. Some other important properties of water that you want to know, all right, and let me just write these out for you, is that it has a high specific heat, all right, which means it takes a lot of energy to warm water up. It it is adhesive, right? It sticks to other things. It is cohesive, all right, and it is polar, it has pH, and it forms hydrogen bonds. It has some other properties such as surface tension and some other things that are important, but for us, these really are the main bits, all right? So go ahead and commit those to memory at some point. Now, our goal through all of this, right, is to learn some basic chemistry so that we can understand how these major classes of organic molecules are going to function. And so we've got carbohydrates, all right, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids, all right? And so you should start familiarizing yourself with the subunits of these, the major functions, and we're going to have an individual lecture on each of these groups, all right? So don't panic if you don't know anything about them really, but start working towards it. Now, the final thing that we're going to talk about in this basic chemistry lecture is functional groups. And what you'll notice is functional groups tend to contain, all right, atoms that differ in electronegativity. So here we have carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, hydrogen, carbon, oxygen, oxygen, hydrogen. And what that leads to, other than our methyl group, is things that differ in charge, and they're reactive. They tend to form bonds. They tend to cause it to be polar, right? And so these functional groups you're going to find and see on all of these biomolecules. Not all of these in one, but as we work our way through all the different biomolecules, we will cover all of these functional groups. So for example, amino acids contain an amino group, which is right here, all right? And they contain a carboxyl group, which is right here, all right? And so this is something that we want to keep in mind as we go forward. All right, thank you, and I hope that this was helpful in terms of getting you kind of up to speed on basic chemistry.